So if you've paid attention within the past few months, you've probably heard about all these semiconductor chips and these shortages, and you're probably wondering about why the whole world seems like it's in a complete mess right now. So I figured we'd take a couple seconds and kind of discuss what happened, why there are shortages, and how this has been affecting different sectors of the global economy. So let's start off by discussing two rental car companies that almost went bankrupt in 2020. So Hertz and Avis both were at the brink of bankruptcy because of the way that tourism was basically come to an end. Flights were being, shut down, people were not traveling because of the coronavirus, and because their whole industry is tourism, that affected them greatly. So to survive, they had to sell off almost all of their cars, which would give them more cash to liquidate, stay afloat, and keep the company solvent until they were able to start the tourism industry again. But how does that affect the world? Well, let's take a look at this, right? There's a simple concept in economics called supply and demand. There has to reach this point of equilibrium where supply equals demand, and that's considered to be the most profitable price point and most profitable production point when it comes to cars, phones, electronics, clothes, whatever the case may be. It goes for everything, even food. So now you've got this huge supply of cars, we're talking thousands, and what that means is the car market has been completely flooded. Now keep in mind that rental car companies aren't really going for your Ferraris, they're not going for your Lamborghinis, they're going more for the affordable, reliable, good old trusty cars like the Camry, the Accord, base model cars from Chevy, Ford, whatever the case may be. They're selling these cars, and they just threw this huge influx of vehicles onto the market. Well, people who are, getting money, or they have the funds, they're looking for a new car, this was a great deal for them because they're getting rental cars, which are generally cheaper because people don't really take care of them, and because they had to sell and they needed money, so obviously there was a discount. So you have all of these cars being bought up. Hertz and Avis did become solvent, and what that meant is as the travel industry started coming back, they needed to buy more cars so that they could rent them out and actually be a functional business. Crazy, I know, right? So here's what happens. Now you've got these major car companies placing orders with Toyota, with Ford, with Honda, Nissan, all of these major, economically efficient cars that rental car companies go for. Well, here's the thing. Now they've actually become solvent. They need to actually buy cars so that they can rent them out in the tourism industry so they can be a functional business. Crazy, I know. So here's what happens. Now they're getting orders from Hertz, Avis, and all these other companies saying, hey, we need 30,000 Camrys, or we need 1,000 F-150s, whatever the case may be. So what's that doing? That shifts that supply-demand level, and now you've got huge demand and lower supply. So what's going on in the rest of the world? Well, if you've been paying attention during this 2021 pandemic or how everything's been going on, there's a couple things that have actually been screwing over our world. So let's put it in this way. With the pandemic, with everything going on, we already had a bit of a shortage going on with semiconductors. So for those of you who don't know, major electronics are built on something called semiconductor chips. These chips are used to power, hardcore performance-based items, whether it's cars, phones, laptops, gaming consoles, whatever the case may be. Point is, we had a shortage. Well, there are a couple things that happened this year that really messed with the way things have been moving. All right, so let's take a look at, starting in February, we had the Texas freeze, right? So for many of you who didn't know, there was this huge storm that went on in Texas. Basically, I think the power grid was almost 30 minutes away from failing completely. Everybody in Texas would have lost power. So they barely caught on in the nick of the woods. Well, the reason this is important is because Texas has the biggest petrochemical complex, which turns natural oil and gases into plastics. So because of everything that was going on in Texas, there was a plastic shortage. So that's also really important when you think about these raw materials that are used in the grand scheme of building these end user products like laptops, phones, and gaming consoles and cars, right? Well, that was just one effect. Don't forget about the big ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Forgive me if I'm saying it wrong, but basically what's happening is that's one of the biggest canals used for global supply chain. Now you've got this big ass ship stuck in the middle, nobody can get through. It got to the point where even Nike was having issues with inventory and storage. And I want you to think about the whole shoe environment right now, right? You got companies like StockX. You look at these shoes like there's the new Dior Air Force Ones. So shoe collectors are obviously very passionate. And when there's a low supply, that demand stays the same. People who want shoes will buy shoes. So here's what's going on. Now you've got the shoe industry hitting a point where that ratio of people flipping it is just getting absurd because they just don't have enough shoes for anything. So it's this crazy little situation that, there's so many different markets being affected by it. Basically what happens is you reach a point where you affect the supply, and if the demand is still there, prices end up skyrocketing to match that level and kind of balance things out and bring them back to equilibrium. The best way to keep prices low is to bring the supply up to match that demand so that you can work on scales of economies, but we're not really too focused on the economical principles here. Make matters worse, there was a fire in Tokyo for a major auto manufacturer, producer of parts. Now, I'm not completely sure about the details, but what I do know is that stocks for Nissan, Honda, and Toyota ended up dropping like 3% because this was a major factory that was being used to produce parts and electronical goods for these car companies. So now you've got even another catalyst on top of everything that's been going on. Now, you have somebody like Jerome Powell who's saying that these are bottlenecks, they'll be taken care of, as the economy grows, we'll get back together. And he's not wrong. At a certain point, you do need to be careful and you need to watch the markets. But that being said, he's absolutely right, and companies have already put in efforts. One of them being that Intel wants to create 2 new factories for creating new chips that will be active by 2024. Now obviously these take billions of dollars, there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into it, a lot of engineering, so it does take time, but it's something to pay attention about. We've reached a point in our world where we've got shortages, we've got an imbalance in supply and demand. So we've seen cars that are overpriced, we've seen gaming consoles that are almost double the price, we've seen iPhones that can't be produced. So we live in this world where there's a high amount of demand, but there's not enough supply. And what that does on the economic scale is that's when you reach the point where you have higher prices to match that demand and bring things down to match the level of supply so that things can kind of reach this point of balance. It's important to note these things because as somebody who's a strong investor, you want to pay attention to how things are going. Also keep in mind that with the way the dollar is being printed right now, inflation is also on the rise. So now you've got low supply, you've got high demand, higher prices, and the value of the dollar being lower. So put all of that into a bucket and you're going to get what we call the cluster of 2021. The reason I bring all this up is because when we look at it from an investor's perspective, it's important to note how things are moving. When we look at levels like inflation of the dollar, you see all these stocks going up and up and up, but I want you to think about what that really means. To me, I see it as a major correction into what our companies are actually valued in correlation to the dollar. If we printed 25% more dollars, right, that means that the average dollar has fallen 25% of its original value. That means that if all the companies stayed at their current stock price, they would be worth 75% of what they were a year ago. To combat that, now you've got this point where the stock market is completely going up, the government is basically pumping money into the market, they're printing more dollars, the value of the dollar is getting lower, stocks are going up, prices are going up for everything. And this is where we reach this point where we have to look at countries like Zimbabwe and think about what this means for long-term hyperinflation. That's why you see so many people jumping on the crypto game. That's why you see so many people taking money out of the stock market. It's one of those points that remind you that it's not good to stay cash. You need to be watching what's going around you. So don't take this video as a panic that, oh, everything's going to shit. No, this is actually not a bad situation, but it is a situation, and as somebody who's invested in themselves, in the world, in the way things are moving, you need to pay attention to these things so that you can adapt, you can reflect, and you can learn. Take a look at the Suez Canal, right? They had an issue. There was a huge global supply chain. What did people do? They started sending ships the other way. 2 weeks longer, but they adapted. They kept things going. They got the ship cleared out, and things are back to normal. Well, as normal as things can be. So let that be a lesson that no matter what's going on in the world, there's always a solution, there's always a way to improvise, and there's always a way to correct yourself. Now, whether you do that in your personal life or whether you do that in trading, it's a great principle to follow, and it's a great skill to have. Now, if I've misspoken at any point in this video, I do humbly apologize, but hopefully the things that I mentioned help kind of explain what's going on in the world with semiconductors, with shortages, and also help you get a little bit more perspective on how to move forward with your daily lives. With that, keep learning, keep loving, keep growing. Thank you, and have a beautiful weekend.